Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Neil Howard. Thank you so much for joining us here on Health Professional Radio. We're going to be speaking in this segment with returning guest Dr. Michael Irizarry. He's joining us here as Senior Vice President, Deputy Chief Clinical Officer, Alzheimer's Disease and Brain Health at Eisai. He's joining us to discuss the FDA acceptance of the company's BLA submission for lecanemab for the treatment of Alzheimer's. Welcome back, Michael. How have you been?
I've been good. Thank you for having me back, Neil.
I did, of course, mention that you're Senior VP there and Deputy Chief Clinical Officer, Alzheimer's Disease and Brain Health. Tell us a little bit about yourself for those who aren't familiar with you as a contributor.
Sure. I'm a neurologist, and I'm responsible for the clinical development programs for neurodegeneration, sleep, and epilepsy at Eisai, a Japanese company with the clinical headquarters based in Nutley, New Jersey in the U.S.
Describe the significance of the FDA accepting lecanemab's BLA. What is a BLA, first of all, and then tell us what's next after this acceptance?
So BLA stands for Biological License Application, and it's a submission for the FDA to review data to determine whether to approve a drug. The accelerated approval pathway is a specific pathway that allows earlier approval of drugs that treat serious conditions that fill an unmet medical need, and that is based on a surrogate outcome. So typically a biomarker outcome, such as a laboratory measurement or a radiographic image or physical exam sign that is predictive of clinical benefit. And the lecanemab BLA was submitted to the FDA based on the phase 2 study data that showed dose and time-dependent clearance of amyloid in the brain using amyloid PET imaging that can see the deposits of amyloid in the brain. Based on that, the FDA is reviewing that data as well as data from the phase 2 open-label extension and blinded safety data from our ongoing phase 3 confirmatory study. And based on the data provided, they agreed to accept that submission, meaning that they accept that submission to review, and they set the date for decision-making to be January 6th of 2023. That's the latest date in which they would say whether the drug would be approved under the accelerated approval pathway or not, although the decision could come earlier. That accelerated approval is contingent on confirming the effect of the drug with regulatory accepted clinical outcome. And that confirmatory clinical trial is our phase 3 Clarity AD study, which is in 1,795 patients with early AD that is due to read out by the end of September or early October.
Elaborate on the diversity of the patient population in that particular study, if you would. You said they all have early Alzheimer's. Are there different age groups, racial background?
Yes, we really made efforts to improve the representativeness of the population in Clarity AD, both with regards to race and ethnicity and also with regards to the common medical conditions that people with Alzheimer's disease and this age have. So in terms of the Clarity AD population, within the U.S., 4.5% of the participants are Black, 22.5% of participants are Hispanic. And the efforts that we incorporated in the clinical trial included selecting clinical trial sites and investigators that had access to diverse populations, also incorporated community outreach, for instance, to community centers or faith-based groups to enroll patients into the clinical trial. And we also initiated more decentralized clinical trial activities, meaning more activities that could be done at home or away from the clinical trial site. This included implementing home intravenous infusions for the treatment or remote assessments of safety and clinical outcomes. I also wanted to highlight that we also made sure that the inclusion criteria for the clinical trial were quite liberal, so that the criteria allowed patients with a broad range of medical problems, in addition to Alzheimer's disease, to participate in the study. So, for instance, in the United States, subpopulation of the clinical trial, over 60% of the people participating have hypertension or hyperlipidemia. Almost 20% of participants have ischemic heart disease or diabetes. And over a quarter are on antidepressants. So we feel that the population that enrolled into the clinical trial is quite representative or can be generalized to the broader early Alzheimer's disease population.
Were there any of these associated conditions that totally invalidated what lecanemab was trying to do with the amyloids? Were there certain conditions that made it just impossible for this compound to even begin to work?
For the clinical trial itself, the main inclusion criteria was that the participant had to be healthy enough to complete 18 months of a double-blind clinical trial. I think we'll learn from the readout of the Clarity AD study exactly whether there are subgroups that may respond more or less based on their baseline characteristics. But at this point, the clinical trial really focused on individuals that had evidence of cognitive impairment that were in the mild stages, either the mild cognitive impairment stage, meaning memory impairment, but with very little functional impairment, or in the mild Alzheimer's disease dementia stage, having some mild functional impairment, but still quite functional. And they had to have confirmation of elevated amyloid in the brain, so confirming that the impairment is due to Alzheimer's disease. Otherwise, the exclusion criteria really did not exclude people that we thought might be less responsive.
What are you doing to prepare physicians for this approval and possible acceptance by Medicare for an Alzheimer's treatment, this particular one?
That's a really great question and very important for the field and for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease patients. And there's several aspects involved with that. With regards to Medicare, Medicare has set up a coverage with evidence determination process for these types of therapies. So depending on the evidence available, Medicare may request additional studies and may only reimburse individuals that participate in those studies to generate the evidence that they require for full coverage. We believe that depending on the results of Clarity AD and the amount of data generated, the representativeness of the subjects with regards to the Medicare population, and the overall evidence of long-term treatment effects from the open label extension and the phase 2, we, depending on the data, would go to CMS and suggest that the evidence generated really supports full reimbursement from Medicare. And otherwise, if there are data gaps, we would generate those from additional studies. That's from the Medicare side. From the overall treatment side, the Clarity AD and the development program would provide the evidence for clinicians to understand the safety and efficacy. And then more broadly, the healthcare system would need to focus on identifying patients, ensuring that people with early cognitive impairment are diagnosed, ensuring that there are tests available to confirm that there is elevated amyloid in the brain, and determine whether individuals are eligible for treatment with lecanemab or other disease-modifying therapies that could be available over the next couple of years. In addition, these therapies may need to be provided by intravenous infusion. That could be done at home or infusion centers, and that capability would need to be set up. Although for lecanemab, we are looking at more user-friendly approaches, such as developing a subcutaneous formulation or developing less frequent maintenance therapies.
give us a website where our listeners can learn more about the developments at Eisai.
I would refer you to the Eisai website, which is us.eisai.com.
And Eisai is spelled
EISAI.
Michael, thank you so much for joining us here and lending us some more of your time. Looking forward to our next conversation as things progress with Clarity AD.
Thank you. A pleasure as always.
You've been listening to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard, in conversation with returning guest Dr. Michael Irizarry. Audio copies of this program are available at hpr.fm and healthprofessionalradio.com.au. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, listen in, download at SoundCloud, and be sure and subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Health Professional Radio.